Today we thank God for the gift of peace, which comes to us through Christ. Somehow peace and Christmas seem like an anachronism sometimes. And one of my jokes, my favorite jokes, might support this theory. A woman greatly frazzled by the season had intended to write a thoughtful Christmas letter. But that didn't happen. It had not been a banner year, and there was nothing she especially wished to communicate. Enough said about that. So, as an alternative to the Christmas letter, she decided to send out a card with a photograph of the family. Well, that didn't materialize because none of the members could reach a consensus as to the best shot. So finally, in desperation, at the 11th hour, she rushed into Rite Aid. She grabbed 4 boxes of the same design. She hand-addressed over 100 of them, and then with a huge sense of accomplishment, she drove down to the post office and plunked them into the box. Feeling this immense sense of relief, she went home. She brewed a pot of coffee. She put up her feet. And finally, she took the chance to read the verse she had sent out. This is what it said. It started out fine. Merry Christmas. So far, so good. Then a nice little verse followed that. But finally, at the very end, it said, and this is just to say, a little gift is on its way. Think you didn't remember that joke? He's planted. So the question is, where is there peace at Christmas? And if it's difficult for us to find peace, how do we in turn give that gift of peace back to Jesus to honor him on his birthday? We know that peace is on his wish list. Jesus, in fact, was called the Prince of Peace. He came into the world surrounded by a chorus of angels singing, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace." And he died, leaving this world his legacy of peace. Peace I leave with you, he said. My peace I give to you. But how do we ourselves give peace to Jesus? Especially when we have such little control on what goes on around us. Certainly on the global and the national front, we feel powerless, but even locally within our own families, we oftentimes find ourselves to be mere bystanders. Sometimes offering peace is no small feat. How many times this past week I've heard the words of Harriet Eaton's favorite hymn, which is, "Let there be peace on earth." And those closing lines in that hymn, "And let it begin with me." The question of the morning is how? How do we let peace begin with us? The answer, as I can best express it, is that we can make room for him. Last week it was reported to me how Pastor Norman Young, who usually always sits where Carolyn Broad is sitting right now, came in and was without a place to sit. His wife, Martha, who would normally have been the navigator, is at Seal Rock. And because of the baptism, a lot of people weren't sitting where they customarily sat, and so he was a bit at sea. In fact, he was so much at sea, I should say, he was over here on this side of the congregation. And then it was that someone noted and reported to me later But someone else stood up, reached out to Norman, put an arm around his shoulder, and said, "Here, Norman, here's a place for you." Those of you who know him can envision right now the expression of peace on Norman's face. There was room for him. All of us know what it feels like to enter life's no vacancy signs, to encounter life's no vacancy signs. We know the turmoil that results when in conversation we discover that there's no room. There's no room for our thoughts. There's no room for our opinions. There's no room for what we really want to say. We know what it feels like in a dying friendship to have the other person let us know that there's no longer time to talk. There's no place for us anymore. Jesus must have known that feeling well. There's no room. He knew it at his birth. He knew when there was no place to lay his head. But we also have those experiences of when we give to each other that gift of peace, when we make room. This morning I asked Tom Bradbury if I should have something like a Quaker service and just put this sermon aside and have us all converse. And he said, it depends. It depends on if you're going to tell a story about Dick or not. So in actual fact, as you read through my manuscript, I have not included Dick in this sermon, but since it was a request, I'm going to tell you an experience of peace that I experienced when I was with Dick. It was when I first discovered that I loved him. It was our second date, and he had invited me to go for a walk. We went walking around, it was in Concord. We went following on a trail, and we went by, you've never heard this story, Julie, so I hope you're listening. What's that?
I don't think she wants to hear.
She doesn't want to hear? She's cringing, I can see it. But at any rate, we went by this pond, and it was so still. Nothing. Not a ripple was on it. Well, you have to take into consideration that I wasn't expecting to fall in love, because I thought that the way you felt you were in love was the way I had felt before, which is when you're on a motorcycle. No, I didn't mean motorcycle. I meant roller coaster. It's different. Okay, all right. I'm getting the sign. And it's that sign, you're so excited and you can't wait to see the person next. And that hadn't happened with us because we saw each other for 5 years and stayed away from each other as far as we possibly could. But this second date, I looked out on the water and I could see the reflection from that pond. I could see all the trees. I could see the clouds. I could see everything. And neither one of us spoke. We just stood there for a long, long time in silence. And I felt this amazing peace. And I heard myself say to him, "This is the way you make my soul feel. This is peace. And peace is love." And I can still say that 25 years later. When I'm with him, he brings me peace. And so we can give to each other peace, but we can give to each other peace by making room for each other. Years ago, I wrote my first and only chancel skit for Christmas, and it was entitled Joe. And it was about a group of cafe buddies who decided that they wanted to honor their friend Joe by throwing him a surprise party for his birthday. And he was everybody's friend, most especially the friend of the residents at the local nursing home. That's what they called it back then, nursing homes, because he volunteered there. But he was also a special friend of the people who ate at the local soup kitchen. That's where he'd go to help serve meals. So anyway, because Joe was so beloved in this community, they wanted to have a party for him, a surprise party. His birthday was December 25th, and it fell on a Wednesday that year, so as a practical matter, they decided to hold the party on a Friday instead. And they were going to have the party at the nursing home, but then they decided that they might make too much noise, so maybe that wouldn't be the place to go. They opted to hold it at the American Legion. And then someone suggested that they go all out and they hold have a nice Swish restaurant as the venue for their party. They realized it did mean that the handicapped couldn't come because it wasn't handicapped accessible, and they knew that the people at the soup kitchen couldn't afford it, but oh well, can't please everybody. The planning continued, and then they realized December is such a busy month. So many people have so much to do. They would put it in the spring sometime. It ended up some date in June, I think it was. Bottom line, you can guess, they did have a party. But in the end, Joe himself did not make it on the guest list. All the well-meaning buddies had a party, but it was without him. Do you want to see this drama sometime? I've told you the plot, that's it. And the purpose of that skit was to reinforce the message in today's passage that we are reminded not to celebrate Christmas without Jesus. We can give him the gift of peace by deciding to make room for him, and we can insist on making sure that we make room for him by giving gifts for the hungry, gifts for the stranger, gifts for people who will never, ever know or see us. This morning's parable tells us that when we die, the Son of Man is going to be asking us one essential question. And given the audience at the time, the listeners in Jesus' day presumably expected some kind of judgment question like, were you faithful to the law? Did you live according to the instructions in the Torah? But according to this parable, Jesus threw a curve. There was one question on this exam, this final exam of life. And that is, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was sick, did you take care of me? When I was a stranger, did you visit me? When I was in prison, did you visit me? You can imagine how those early listeners must have felt. That wasn't supposed to be on the test. That stuff that separated the sheep from the goats. But Jesus said, yes, that is on the test. It's the only question. Some of the people who heard the parable were probably very compassionate. Some of them may have known a lot about the problems of the poor. And maybe they privately agonized over their plight. Maybe they talked about their needs at town meetings. But here, concern in and of itself doesn't earn any points. It's only action that does. The test question is, what did you do to respond to other people's needs? If this didn't give Jesus' listeners enough to think about, then the very last statement he said would have. The King, the Son of Man, says, truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me. This past week, I was reading an article about Pastor Mayer of Grace Street Ministries, Mother Teresa of Portland, as I call her. And this is what she said about her ministry on the streets of the homeless. She said, I look for the sacred in every person I meet, whether it's an interested executive or it's someone huddled in a doorway. And for those of you who heard her preach here, did you see the joy on her face a few weeks ago? You cannot look at her face without knowing that she has found him over and over and over again. She's found him in the streets of Portland because she's been willing to make room for them. And we find them. We find them here, where we live, whenever we are willing to make room for each other. 2 weeks from today, Christmas will be over. Can you believe that? And each of us will have had our own private chance to honor Christ's birth. If we have allowed ourselves to make room for him, then Christ will, without fail, be born anew. He will be born again. He will be born in us. Thanks be to God. Amen.